It was just another regular day for Mark Reynolds. Or so everyone thought. The sun was barely up, and the streets were filled with the usual buzz of morning activity, cars honking, people rushing to work, and shopkeepers setting up their stalls. For most, it was just a normal start to another busy day in the city. But for Mark, it was far from ordinary. Beneath the surface of his calm, unassuming appearance, there was something much bigger. Something far more dangerous. Mark didn't look like the kind of person who would stand out in a crowd. He was an average man, dressed in simple clothes, jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers. His face was clean-shaven, his hair neatly kept, but nothing about him screamed power. To anyone who didn't know him, he was just another guy in the crowd, another face in the city's never-ending flow of people. But there was a reason for that. His quiet, calm demeanor was no accident. It was a mask, a carefully crafted shield that kept the real Mark Reynolds hidden from the world. You see, Mark wasn't just any man. He had a secret that could shake the very foundation of the city. A secret so big that if anyone knew the truth about who he really was, everything they thought they knew about the world would come crashing down. Mark wasn't just a regular guy living a quiet life. He was an undercover CIA agent, one of the best at what he did. For years, he had lived in the shadows, blending in, playing his part. His job was to gather information, to infiltrate groups that were far too dangerous for anyone else to even think about. He was a master of staying unnoticed, of pretending to be just another face in the crowd. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. Mark had been working undercover for the CIA for years, in dangerous territories that most people would never dare to step into. He had worked in foreign countries, dealing with criminals, spies, and even terrorists. His job was to be everywhere and nowhere at once. To blend in so well that no one ever suspected him. His mission was simple: gather the information that no one else could get. But there was one thing that made Mark's mission different from anyone else's. Mark wasn't just a CIA agent. He was also black. In a world that was still dealing with the ugly scars of racism, Mark's identity was both his strength and his weakness. On one hand, being black gave him an edge. He was often underestimated, which allowed him to slip past people's defenses without them even realizing it. People didn't expect much from him. They didn't expect him to be smart or dangerous. They didn't expect him to be capable of doing the things he could do. But that worked to his advantage. It was a weapon. And he used it well. But on the other hand, being black also meant that Mark had to constantly fight against the prejudice that surrounded him. He had to prove himself over and over again, just to be seen as equal. He had to navigate a world where some people saw him as nothing more than the color of his skin, where his worth was often questioned before he even opened his mouth. And that was hard. It wore him down. It made him angry at times. But it also made him stronger. Because Mark Reynolds didn't let the world tell him who he was. He was the one who got to decide that. And so, he stayed hidden. He stayed in the shadows, where people couldn't see him coming. For years, Mark had kept his real identity locked away, never once letting the truth slip. Not a single person knew that beneath the calm, average man they saw every day, there was a CIA agent working tirelessly to keep them safe. He didn't talk about his work. He didn't mention the dangerous missions he had completed or the enemies he had faced. It wasn't just because it was classified. It was because it was his own personal battle, one that he couldn't share with anyone. But now, Mark was about to cross paths with someone who would change everything. Someone who wouldn't see his hidden strength. Someone who wouldn't understand why he had stayed quiet all these years. And that someone was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Officer Dan Hargrove wasn't just another cop. He wasn't the kind of officer who patrolled the streets with the intention of keeping the peace. He didn't care much for justice. To him, the law was simply a tool, his tool. A tool he used to control everything around him. His view of the world was simple and rigid: there were people who belonged, and then there were those who didn't. And Mark Reynolds, in his eyes, didn't belong. Mark didn't fit into Hargrove's narrow vision of who should be allowed to walk freely on the streets. He wasn't the right kind of person. He wasn't the kind of person Hargrove could control. And that, more than anything, made Mark a target. It all started with a simple encounter. Mark was walking down a quiet street on a warm afternoon, just another day in his routine. The street was calm, with only a few pedestrians moving about, and the usual hum of city sounds. Mark had no reason to expect anything unusual to happen. He was dressed casually, nothing that would draw attention, just like every other day. But today was different. Without warning, Mark noticed the police car pull up beside him. It was a black and white patrol car, the kind you couldn't miss. The vehicle slowed down as it came closer, and Mark's attention shifted immediately. He wasn't worried. He was used to interactions like these. But something about this moment felt off, like the atmosphere itself had shifted. The car came to a stop beside him, and the window rolled down. Mark didn't need to look to know who it was behind the wheel. Officer Dan Hargrove. Mark had seen him around before. The officer wasn't exactly a stranger, but they had never spoken. Hargrove had a reputation, though, one that Mark had heard about. Everyone knew that Hargrove was a cop with an agenda. Hargrove's eyes locked with Mark's the moment he stepped into view. His gaze was cold and calculating, and for a brief second, Mark could feel the hostility radiating from him. There was no warmth, no respect in that look. Just a cold, dismissive judgment. Mark had learned to read people, to sense when things were about to take a turn for the worse. And this was one of those moments. "What are you doing here?" Hargrove's voice cut through the quiet of the street like a sharp knife. The words were simple, but the tone was laced with something darker. It was the kind of question that didn't invite a real answer. The kind of question where the speaker had already made up their mind about you. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't react. He stood there, eyes steady, his posture calm. He knew this wasn't just a random stop. This wasn't a routine check. Hargrove wasn't asking out of curiosity or concern. He was asking because he wanted to prove something. He wanted to remind Mark, in that moment, that he didn't belong. That Mark wasn't the kind of person Hargrove felt should be walking the streets without a reason. "I'm just walking," Mark replied evenly, keeping his voice calm, controlled. His response wasn't defensive, but it wasn't apologetic either. Mark had been trained to keep his emotions in check, to maintain his composure no matter what. He knew that any sign of fear or unease would only feed into Hargrove's need to assert control. But Hargrove wasn't satisfied with the answer. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as if looking for a weakness. "Walking where? And for what reason?" His words were slow, deliberate. The accusation was clear: Mark didn't belong here. Not in this neighborhood, not in the space he occupied. There was no reason for him to be there, in Hargrove's mind. Mark stood his ground. Inside, his mind was racing, but on the outside, he remained calm. He had been in worse situations before. He knew how to handle this. Hargrove was trying to provoke him, trying to force him into a position where Mark would either react in fear or anger. But Mark wasn't going to play that game. He knew it wasn't just about this street, or even this conversation. Hargrove was sending a message. This wasn't just about Mark being in the wrong place. This was about power. It was about Hargrove wanting to remind Mark and anyone else watching that he was the one in control. And Mark was the one who had to prove he could stand up to it. Mark kept his response simple. "Just walking. No harm in that." But Hargrove didn't like that answer. His lips curled into a sneer. "You know, you don't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mark didn't need to hear more to understand the sentiment. Hargrove wasn't just questioning his presence, he was telling Mark, in no uncertain terms, that he didn't have the right to be there. That people like him didn't deserve to occupy space in the places where Hargrove decided who belonged. The words stung, but Mark didn't let it show. Instead, he stood tall, his shoulders squared, facing Hargrove directly. The weight of what was happening settled over him, a tension that Mark had felt before. It wasn't the first time he had been judged for who he was. It wasn't the first time he had been singled out by someone who thought they had the right to define his worth. But that didn't make it any easier. Mark knew what this was. It wasn't just a casual encounter. Hargrove was testing him. He was pushing, trying to see how far he could go. He wanted to see if he could intimidate Mark, if he could break him. But Mark wouldn't let that happen. Not today. Not ever. "Is there a problem, officer?" Mark asked, his voice firm. It wasn't an aggressive challenge, but it was clear. It was a statement. He wasn't backing down. Hargrove paused for a moment, as if considering Mark's question. Then, with a flick of his hand, he motioned for Mark to move along. "Just keep walking," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. "Don't let me catch you around here again." Mark nodded, not bothering to respond. He turned away, continuing his walk down the street, but the weight of the encounter lingered in the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. This wasn't over. Hargrove wasn't going to let it go. Mark knew that. As Mark walked further, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the start of something bigger. He had been in situations like this before: racism, prejudice, hate. It wasn't new to him. But this was different. There was something in Hargrove's eyes, something that told Mark this wouldn't be a simple, one-off encounter. Hargrove had a reason for targeting him. He had a reason for making it personal. As Mark walked further down the street, his mind was buzzing with the encounter. Hargrove's words echoed in his head. "You don't belong here." The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He had dealt with racism before, but it still hurt, every time. It didn't matter how many times he was told to keep walking or how many times he was treated like he didn't matter. It still stung. Mark had learned to bury that anger deep inside. He couldn't afford to let it show. Not as a CIA agent. Not as a black man trying to navigate a world that was constantly trying to put him in his place. He had to be smarter. He had to be better. He had to stay calm, no matter what was thrown at him. But today was different. There was something in the way Hargrove looked at him, something that made Mark's skin crawl. It wasn't just about the words he had said. It was the way he said them. The sneer. The disgust. Mark had felt that before, in the way people looked at him when they didn't think he could see. It wasn't just hate. It was a belief that someone like him didn't deserve to walk free, to exist in the spaces that others took for granted. And Mark wasn't sure if he could keep pretending it didn't bother him. He walked on, trying to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. He knew Hargrove wasn't done with him. This wasn't just a passing encounter. Mark had seen it in the officer's eyes. Hargrove was looking for a reason to escalate things, to push Mark to the edge. It wasn't enough to just make him feel small. No, Hargrove wanted to break him. And for a moment, Mark couldn't help but wonder if this was all leading to something worse. Mark had dealt with hostile situations before, and he had learned to be patient. The job required it. Patience, observation, and precision. He had trained himself to think 2 steps ahead, to never let his emotions cloud his judgment. But there were days when it felt impossible. There were days when the weight of it all, being constantly judged, being constantly on guard, felt like too much. He paused at the corner of the street, his eyes scanning the area. The streets were still calm, but there was an underlying tension now. Mark could feel it in the air. It was like a storm was brewing, and he wasn't sure when it would hit, but he knew it was coming. As he turned the corner, Mark spotted Hargrave's patrol car in his rearview mirror, parked just a little too far down the road. Mark couldn't see the officer, but he could feel his presence like a heavy weight on his shoulders. Mark's instincts screamed at him to move faster, to get out of the area. But he didn't. He wouldn't let Hargrove chase him off. He had every right to walk these streets, to exist in this space. No one had the right to make him feel like he didn't belong. Mark kept walking, his pace steady but deliberate. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the patrol car. But he knew Hargrove was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The problem with people like Hargrove wasn't just that they wanted to control others. It was that they saw themselves as above everyone else. They didn't care about reason. They didn't care about fairness. They only cared about making sure that those they considered beneath them knew their place. Mark wasn't about to let Hargrove get away with it. He made his way down the next block, trying to keep his focus. But every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, making sure he wasn't being followed too closely. He had to stay alert. In his line of work, one wrong move could mean disaster. But this wasn't about his mission. This was personal. This was about standing up for himself in a world that constantly told him he didn't have the right to do so. It wasn't long before Mark turned another corner, only to find himself face to face with Officer Hargrove once more. This time, Hargrove wasn't in his car. He was standing on the sidewalk, blocking Mark's path. His arms were crossed, his posture rigid and confrontational. Mark stopped in his tracks. He had expected something like this. He had known Hargrove wouldn't let him just walk away. The two men locked eyes again. Hargrave's face was a mask of disdain, but Mark refused to look away. He wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything he had been through. Not after all the times he had been pushed around by people like Hargrove. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Hargrove cut him off. "I told you before," the officer sneered, "you don't belong here. You should know your place." Mark felt his pulse quicken. It was one thing to be treated with disrespect, but this was something else entirely. This was an open challenge. Hargrove wasn't just trying to intimidate him now, he was trying to provoke him. He was trying to force Mark to react. Mark took a deep breath. He knew what was at stake. If he let himself get pulled into a confrontation, he might lose control. And if he lost control, Hargrove would win. Mark wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him angry, of seeing him weak. He took another step forward, maintaining eye contact with Hargrove. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a quiet fire in it. "I'm not going anywhere." Hargrave's sneer deepened, and for a moment, it looked like he might say something else. But then something shifted. A realization, maybe. Mark wasn't reacting the way he had hoped. Mark wasn't scared. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't the kind of person Hargrove could bully into submission. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension. It felt like anything could happen. Mark had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't a mission. This was a man who hated him for no reason other than the color of his skin. And that made it personal. Hargrove took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. "You're making a mistake, buddy," he growled. Mark didn't move. "I'm just walking," he said again, his voice unwavering. He wasn't going to give Hargrove what he wanted. For a few long seconds, neither man spoke. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. But then, Hargrove stepped back, his eyes narrowing with frustration. He didn't like that Mark wasn't afraid. He didn't like that he couldn't control the situation. Without another word, Hargrove turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Mark standing there, his heart still pounding. Mark let out a slow breath, his fists clenched at his sides. He knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hargrove had made his move, and Mark had stood his ground. But that was just the beginning. If there was one thing Mark had learned over the years, it was that people like Hargrove didn't give up easily. This wasn't just about a man being judged by the color of his skin. This was about power. This was about a system that protected people like Hargrove and allowed them to continue their harmful behavior. And Mark wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. He turned and walked away, but in his heart, he knew this wasn't the last time he would cross paths with Officer Dan Hargrove. Weeks passed, and the tension between Mark and Officer Hargrove didn't fade. It grew, like a storm cloud gathering above them, heavy and full of anger. Hargrove seemed to enjoy making Mark's life difficult. Every time Mark was out on the streets, it felt like Hargrove was watching, waiting for the smallest mistake, the tiniest excuse to make his life harder. Mark could feel it. He could feel the weight of Hargrove's gaze on him every time he stepped outside. The officer would show up at the most unexpected moments. It wasn't just about enforcing the law anymore, it was about making Mark feel small. It was about reminding him that, to someone like Hargrove, he didn't belong. It was subtle at first. The little comments. The raised eyebrows. The way Hargrove would make sure to get too close, too personal, when he spoke. It was all a game to him. Mark had seen enough of these kinds of people in his line of work to know what was happening. Hargrove was trying to assert control. He was trying to make Mark feel powerless. But Mark wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He wasn't the kind of man who let people like Hargrove win. Every time Hargrove made a move, Mark took note. He learned. He watched. He observed. Mark had learned a long time ago that the key to winning wasn't just about reacting. It was about understanding. Understanding your enemy, understanding their motives, their weaknesses. And that was exactly what Mark was doing with Hargrove. The more Mark encountered Hargrove, the more he realized that the officer wasn't acting on his own. There was something deeper at play here. Mark began to see patterns in Hargrove's behavior. It wasn't just random hate. There was a reason behind it. But what was it? It was a long, frustrating game of cat and mouse. Mark knew Hargrove was trying to get under his skin, but he refused to let it happen. Still, Mark couldn't ignore the growing feeling in his gut something wasn't right. There was more to this than just a racist cop looking to bully a man. Mark had seen enough of the world to know that people like Hargrove didn't act without a reason. They didn't just wake up one day and decide to be evil. No, there was always a deeper motivation. And then, one day, Mark discovered something that made everything click into place. It happened during a case that Mark was working on. He had been following the trail of a dangerous criminal organization for months, collecting evidence and building a case that could bring them down for good. It was complicated work, requiring careful planning and attention to detail. But it wasn't just any case. It was one that Hargrove had been involved with too. At first, Mark didn't think much of it. After all, Hargrove was a cop, and he was just doing his job. But as Mark dug deeper into the details of the case, he started noticing small inconsistencies. There were certain pieces of evidence that Hargrove had been involved with, small pieces that didn't add up. A few leads that he had ignored. Some documents that had gone missing. At first, it was just a hunch, a feeling in the back of Mark's mind. But the more he looked, the more he began to realize that Hargrove wasn't just a cop. He was a part of something much darker. Mark kept digging, taking care to cover his tracks, making sure Hargrove wouldn't realize that he was onto him. It wasn't just about exposing Hargrove's corruption anymore. It was about understanding the full picture. Why was Hargrove involved? What was his role in this web of crime and lies? The answers didn't come quickly. It took weeks of painstaking work gathering pieces of information, making connections between small clues. But slowly, Mark started to put the pieces together. Hargrove wasn't just a racist cop with a personal vendetta. He was a player in a much bigger game. A corrupt cop working for the very criminals he was supposed to be hunting down. And the more Mark uncovered, the more he realized how deep Hargrove's involvement went. The discovery shook Mark to his core. It was one thing to deal with a racist cop. But it was something else entirely to realize that Hargrove was part of the very system he was supposed to be protecting. Mark had always known there were bad people in positions of power, but he had never imagined it would be someone so close to him. Someone in his own city. As Mark connected the dots, he realized just how far-reaching Hargrove's corruption went. Hargrove wasn't just turning a blind eye to crime, he was actively helping criminals. He was accepting bribes, making deals, and covering up evidence. He was a part of the criminal network that Mark had been working to take down. Mark had been in dangerous situations before. He had faced threats, had been hunted by the people he was investigating. But this was different. This wasn't just a fight against crime, it was a fight against the system itself. A system that allowed people like Hargrove to thrive, to hurt others without fear of consequences. But Mark wasn't the kind of person to back down. He wasn't going to let someone like Hargrove destroy everything he had worked for. He had come too far. He had seen too much. And now, he had a responsibility to stop Hargrove and expose the corruption that ran through the city like a poison. Mark spent the next few days planning his next move. He knew he couldn't take Hargrove down alone. He needed backup. He needed someone who could help him gather more evidence, someone who could back him up if things went wrong. But he also knew that he had to be careful. Hargrove wasn't the only dangerous player in this game. There were others out there who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Mark's mind raced as he thought through the details of his plan. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. This was bigger than just him. This was about exposing the truth and taking down a corrupt system that had been hurting people for far too long. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be risks, dangers, and sacrifices. But Mark wasn't afraid. He had been preparing for this moment his whole life. This was his mission. And he wasn't going to stop until it was finished. The next time Mark crossed paths with Officer Hargrove, it would be different. It wouldn't be just another encounter on the street. It would be the moment everything changed. Mark was ready to make his move. The weeks that followed were some of the most intense of Mark's career. As he quietly pieced together the puzzle, he felt the weight of his discovery bearing down on him. He had stumbled upon something far bigger than he had expected, and now the stakes were higher than ever. Mark couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Hargrove wasn't just a rogue cop, he was a well-entrenched part of a system that was rotting from the inside out. The corruption went deep, and it was clear that Hargrove was only one of many officers involved. If Mark exposed him without careful planning, he could bring the entire corrupt network crashing down, or worse, he could be silenced before he even had the chance. There were days when Mark questioned his next steps. He knew that going up against someone like Hargrove, someone who had the power of the law behind him, would be dangerous. It wasn't just about catching a bad cop, it was about taking down a criminal enterprise that stretched across the city's law enforcement. Mark wasn't dealing with a simple case of racism or personal vendetta anymore. He was fighting a battle against a corrupt system that used its power to destroy lives, to protect the guilty, and to keep the innocent under control. Mark's thoughts would often race late into the night. He would sit at his small desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, files, and photographs, and try to make sense of it all. He would trace the same patterns over and over again, looking for a flaw, a slip-up. But every time, the evidence pointed in the same direction. Hargrove was deeply involved in the criminal organization, working with them, protecting them, even aiding them. Mark couldn't believe how deep it went. He had thought he had seen the worst in his line of work. But this was different. This was the very foundation of law enforcement itself, corrupt and rotten to the core. Mark realized just how vulnerable he was in this situation. Hargrove had power. He had the badge. He had connections. And if Mark made one wrong move, he could be lost. But Mark had something Hargrove didn't, the truth. And with the truth, Mark had the power to make a difference. He knew that exposing the corruption wouldn't just change his life, it would change the lives of countless others who had been hurt by the system. It wouldn't be easy. In fact, it would be one of the most difficult battles he'd ever fought. But Mark couldn't back down now. He couldn't let the system win. As the days passed, Mark continued his investigation, becoming more careful with each step. He reached out to trusted allies, people he knew he could count on. One of them, a former detective named Sarah Turner, was a seasoned investigator who had seen her fair share of corruption within the police force. Mark approached her cautiously, knowing that she would be a key ally in exposing Hargrove's crimes. She had connections, knowledge, and an understanding of the inner workings of the police department that Mark didn't have. When Mark shared his findings with her, Sarah was shocked. She had suspected corruption within the department for years, but nothing as deep and widespread as what Mark was uncovering. She agreed to help him, but only if they could do it carefully. If they acted too quickly, they could blow their cover and put themselves in serious danger. The stakes were higher than ever. Together, Mark and Sarah began to formulate a plan. They would need more evidence, more witnesses. They needed to build a case that could stand up in court, something that would be impossible for Hargrove or any of his allies to dismiss. It was going to take time, and it was going to take careful work. But with Sarah's help, Mark felt like they had a real chance. Meanwhile, Hargrove continued to make his presence known, his threats growing more direct. Mark could feel the pressure mounting. The officer would often appear at the same places Mark was working, as if he was watching him, testing him. Mark knew Hargrove had to be suspicious by now. He had been in this game long enough to know that when things seemed too quiet, it meant someone was watching. But Mark remained calm, cool, and collected. He refused to show any signs of fear. He knew that revealing too much too soon would give Hargrove the advantage. Every encounter with Hargrove was a chance for Mark to learn more, to gather more evidence. Every word, every action, every look from Hargrove was a piece of the puzzle. And Mark was getting closer to solving it. One night, after a particularly tense encounter with Hargrove, Mark found something that made his heart race. It was a piece of evidence that could change everything. A single document that Hargrove had overlooked, a small slip-up that Mark had caught. It wasn't much, just a few words scribbled on a piece of paper, but it was enough to confirm what Mark had suspected all along. Hargrove wasn't just working for the criminals, he was involved in the very heart of the operation. The document contained details about a meeting between Hargrove and some of the city's most notorious criminals. It was clear from the notes that Hargrove had been playing both sides, pretending to work with law enforcement while secretly collaborating with the criminals. The meeting details were chilling: illegal transactions, bribes, and even plans to sabotage ongoing investigations. It was all there, written in black and white. Mark couldn't believe his eyes. This was the evidence he had been waiting for. It was a clear link between Hargrove and the criminal organization. But Mark knew that he couldn't act on it alone. He needed to bring in Sarah, get her input, and work together to ensure that they had everything they needed before they made their move. As Mark prepared to meet Sarah, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every day that passed brought him closer to exposing Hargrove, but it also brought Hargrove closer to discovering Mark's investigation. The pressure was on. But Mark was ready. He had come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. The room was thick with tension as Mark stood over Officer Hargraves' desk, the weight of the evidence in his hand. Hargraves' initial confidence seemed to waver, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the arrogant cop was on the defensive. Mark's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. He had prepared for this moment for months. He had gathered every shred of evidence, every small clue, and now it was time to confront the man who had tormented him. Hargraves' smug grin slowly disappeared as his eyes darted over the documents Mark had placed before him. It was clear from the look in Hargraves' eyes that he recognized the significance of what was in front of him. The officer's hands trembled slightly, betraying the mask of calm he usually wore. Mark could feel the power shift. The tables had turned. "What is this?" Hargraves' voice was strained, trying to maintain control. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the papers in front of him. But Mark could see the cracks in his facade. For once, the cocky cop didn't have all the answers. Mark didn't answer right away. He stood there, watching as Hargraves' mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Mark could almost hear the thoughts running through the officer's head. How did he know? Who else was involved? Had the whole operation been compromised? "I think it's time you learned who I really am," Mark said, his voice steady, cold, and unwavering. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, watching as Hargraves' expression shifted from confusion to something more dangerous: fear. Fear. It was something Mark had never seen in Hargrove before. The officer was always the one who instilled fear in others, using his badge and his position of power to manipulate and control. But now, Mark had the upper hand. Now, Hargrove was the one who was afraid. Mark took a step back, letting the silence stretch between them. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. In that moment, Mark knew that this was the turning point. There was no going back. He had made it this far, and now he had to see it through. Hargraves' eyes flicked from the papers back to Mark, his gaze hardening. He tried to regain his composure, but it was clear that something had shifted. The arrogance that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by a dangerous edge. "Who are you?" Hargrove asked, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something else. Mark could hear the fear in his voice. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm doing what you should have done a long time ago," Mark replied, his tone calm but filled with an authority that came from knowing the truth. "I'm bringing this to light. I'm exposing you for the fraud and the criminal you are." Hargraves' face twisted in anger, his fists clenching at his sides. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You don't know what you're messing with," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're the only one with power? You think you can bring me down?" Mark didn't flinch. He had prepared for this moment. He knew Hargrove would try to intimidate him, try to make him doubt himself. But Mark was resolute. He had seen too much, learned too much, and suffered too much to back down now. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Mark said. "I'm taking you down." Hargrove took a step forward, his eyes burning with fury. "You think you're the hero here," he spat. "You're nothing but a pawn in a bigger game. You don't even know what you're up against." Mark's gaze never wavered. He had seen enough to understand the depths of the corruption that ran through the police department, through the very heart of the system. Hargrove wasn't the only one. There were other cops, other officials who were just as guilty. But Mark knew that exposing Hargrove would be the first step. It would be the catalyst that would bring the whole operation crumbling down. "You're right about one thing," Mark said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I'm not a hero. But I'm not a pawn either. I'm someone who's tired of watching people like you get away with murder." Hargraves' face turned red with rage, and for a moment, Mark thought he might lash out physically. But instead, the officer let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You really think you can make a difference?" Hargrove mocked. "This is bigger than you, bigger than me. You're nothing. Just another face in the crowd." Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words ever could. The evidence in front of them was damning. There was no escaping it now. Hargrove knew it. Mark knew it. And somewhere, deep down, Hargrove realized that his time was running out. The door to the office suddenly swung open, and Sarah stepped inside. She had been waiting outside, monitoring the situation, ready to step in if things went south. Her eyes flicked from Mark to Hargrove, taking in the tension in the room. "Mark, are you okay?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. "I'm fine," Mark replied, never taking his eyes off Hargrove. "This is it. It's over for him." Sarah moved to stand next to Mark, her presence a silent show of support. She, too, had seen the evidence, and she knew what it meant. Hargrove's days as a cop were numbered. The corruption he had helped foster was about to come crashing down around him. Hargrove seemed to deflate in that moment, the anger draining from his face. The realization that there was no way out, no escape, seemed to settle in. He looked at the papers in front of him one last time, and Mark could see the defeat in his eyes. "You've won," Hargrove muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded. "No, Hargrove. Justice has won." Hours passed, but the city was still in a state of disbelief. News outlets were flooded with updates, broadcasts, and reports. The story had broken wide open, and the truth was undeniable. Officer Dan Hargrove, the arrogant cop who had abused his power for so long, was finally arrested for his numerous crimes. His reputation, built on intimidation and corruption, had been destroyed in a matter of hours. It was like a storm that tore through the city, shaking everyone from their complacency. People were stunned. It wasn't just the news of Hargrove's arrest, it was the realization that someone had dared to expose him. The system that had protected him, that had allowed him to abuse his position for years, was finally being held accountable. But Mark, the man who had made this possible, felt nothing like the excitement or sense of triumph others might have expected. For Mark, there was no feeling of celebration. He had done what needed to be done, but it didn't bring him joy. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes with knowing justice had finally been served, no matter how long it had taken. It wasn't a victory he could cheer for, but it was a small step toward fixing something much larger. As he walked through the city that evening, Mark saw the difference. People were talking, gathered in groups, discussing what had happened. There was a shift in the air. A few weeks ago, these same streets had been filled with fear, and now, for the first time, there was hope. Mark had managed to break the silence, to expose the truth, and in doing so, he had done something far more important than bringing one man to justice. He had sparked a change. Even in the midst of the growing sense of unity, Mark remained calm. He walked through the streets unnoticed, despite the fact that the news was filled with stories of his actions. The community, once divided by fear, now seemed to be slowly coming together, talking to each other, sharing stories of how they had been affected by the corruption that had run unchecked for so long. It wasn't just about Hargrove anymore. It was about the system. It was about the people who had been too afraid to speak out, who had been oppressed and silenced for years. Mark had proven that there were still people who would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. But for Mark, it was never about the spotlight. He never wanted to be the hero or the face of change. He wanted the truth to be known, and that was enough for him. The work was not done, not by a long shot, but it was a start. One small action had set off a chain reaction. The corrupt system that Hargrove had been a part of was no longer untouchable. It was vulnerable, and that was something no one could ignore anymore. As Mark made his way back to his apartment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Sarah. "Sarah, they arrested Hargrove. The news is everywhere." "You did it, Mark. You actually did it?" Mark didn't immediately reply. Instead, he stood in the hallway outside his door, taking a deep breath. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The work was far from over. There were more people like Hargrove out there, more corruption, more injustice. He had exposed one piece of the puzzle, but the bigger picture was still hidden. He finally typed back. "Mark, we did it. But we're just getting started." He hit send and tucked the phone back into his pocket. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe, to reflect on the path that had brought him here. It had been long. It had been difficult. And it had cost him more than he cared to admit. But in the end, he had done what he set out to do. And the city, the people, were a little safer for it. The news of Hargrove's arrest spread like wildfire. It was all anyone could talk about for days. The community, divided for so long by the fear of retaliation, began to find its voice. People who had once been too scared to speak out now found the courage to share their own stories. There were whispers in the streets, stories of how Hargrove had terrorized people, how he had used his badge as a weapon. But as the truth came to light, so did the realization that Hargrove wasn't the only one. He had been a part of a larger network, a system that had allowed corruption to thrive for far too long. The more Mark and Sarah dug into Hargrove's past, the more they uncovered. The officer had been a key player in a web of lies, using his position to cover up illegal activities, turning a blind eye to drug dealing, theft, and even worse. The local news channels began to report on the full scope of Hargrove's corruption, and as the story grew, so did the calls for accountability. The public outcry was immense. People were furious, not just with Hargrove but with the entire system that had protected him. They demanded that others in the department be investigated. They demanded change. They wanted a system that was built on integrity, not on lies and power. In the days that followed, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. People were no longer afraid to speak up. Protests were organized, demanding justice not just for the people harmed by Hargrove's actions, but for the entire community that had been living under the threat of corruption for far too long. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment that had been waiting to happen for years. Mark continued to stay out of the spotlight, working quietly behind the scenes with Sarah. They knew that exposing one corrupt cop was just the beginning. There were still more, and they were going to make sure they were held accountable. The system would not change overnight, but the first step had been taken. The momentum was there. As weeks passed, the once fractured community began to heal. People felt empowered in ways they hadn't before. They spoke openly about their experiences, and the conversations shifted. No longer were people afraid to tell their stories. The fear that had once gripped the city began to loosen, replaced by a quiet hope. Mark watched from the shadows, always observing, always planning. He was just one man, but he had proven that even one person could make a difference. The arrests didn't stop with Hargrove. One by one, other officers and officials were exposed. The web of corruption slowly unraveled, piece by piece. The changes weren't immediate, but they were undeniable. There were still struggles, still battles to be fought, but Mark had proven that it was possible to fight back. Justice wasn't something that came easily, but it was something worth fighting for. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city, Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The work wasn't over, but it was a start. He had played his part, and now it was time for others to pick up the mantle. The battle for justice was far from finished. But with every truth that came to light, the city grew stronger. And for the first time in a long time, the people believed that change was possible. Mark had known all along that bringing down someone like Hargrove wasn't just about one man, it was about something bigger. It was about changing the system, about showing that no one, no matter how powerful, could stand above the law. And as the days went by, the truth that Mark had fought for spread, creating ripples that reached far beyond the city. The struggle was far from over, but Mark had shown that with courage and determination, even the most corrupt systems could be torn down. And that, in the end, was the most powerful thing of all. Mark stood at the edge of the rooftop, gazing out at the city below. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It had been a long journey, one filled with challenges, but in the end, it had all been worth it. He had set out to bring justice to a corrupt system, to expose the wrongdoings of a man who had used his power to hurt others. And in doing so, Mark had done more than just bring down a corrupt cop. He had sparked a change, a shift that was beginning to ripple through the community. He had stayed quiet, hidden in the shadows, for so long. But when the time had come, he had acted. Mark had always believed that true strength didn't come from shouting the loudest, from demanding attention. True strength came from knowing when to stay silent, from understanding that sometimes, the most powerful actions are the ones that are not seen until the right moment. As the cool evening breeze brushed against his face, Mark thought about everything that had happened. The anger, the frustration, the fear, all of it had been a part of the journey. But in the end, it had been his quiet resolve, his ability to bide his time and wait for the right opportunity, that had made all the difference. He had been underestimated by many, even by those closest to him. But that had never bothered him. He knew who he was, and more importantly, he knew what he stood for. The world often judges people by what they can see, their appearance, their status, their outward strength. People like Hargrove, who used their power to control others, relied on this judgment. They believed that if they could intimidate and dominate, they would always win. They thought they could spot weakness from a distance, and in doing so, they failed to see what was truly strong. Mark had never been the loudest in the room. He had never been the one to seek attention. But when the time came, when it mattered most, Mark had used his silence, his patience, and his inner strength to fight back. He had shown that true power didn't come from noise or violence. It came from purpose, from a deep understanding of what was right, and from the quiet determination to make a difference. He knew that people would remember Hargrove, but he also knew that Hargrove's story would not be the one that lasted. It was Mark's story, the story of the quiet man who had stood up against a corrupt system that would inspire others. It would be a story that people would talk about for years to come. A story about someone who had never sought fame, but had earned respect through his actions. A story about someone who had quietly, patiently, and steadily brought justice where it had been missing. Mark looked down at the streets below. The city, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now seemed different. People were no longer walking with their heads down. They were talking to each other, sharing their experiences, and demanding change. The walls that had separated them, the fear that had kept them silent, were slowly crumbling. It wasn't just the end of Hargrove's reign, it was the beginning of something bigger. People were starting to believe that they could make a difference, that they too could fight for what was right. In that moment, Mark realized something important: sometimes, the strongest people are those who stay silent. They are the ones who understand the importance of timing, of knowing when to act and when to wait. They are the ones who, in their quiet strength, have the power to change the world. And for Mark, this wasn't about him. It was about the community, the people who had been living in fear for so long. It was about showing them that they didn't have to be afraid anymore. They could stand up. They could fight back. As Mark turned away from the rooftop, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he had set out to do. The work was far from over, but it was a start. He had fought for justice, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. and in the process, he had inspired others to do the same. A lesson for us all. The story of Mark Reynolds is one that reminds us of the power of silence, of patience, and of quiet determination. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices and the biggest gestures, it's easy to forget that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who don't shout the loudest. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who wait, who observe, and who understand that true strength is found not in confrontation, but in knowing when and how to act. Mark's story is a lesson for all of us. It teaches us that we don't have to fit into the mold that society expects. We don't have to be the loudest, the most aggressive, or the most forceful to make a difference. All it takes is knowing what's right, having the courage to stand by that truth, and having the patience to wait for the right moment to act. Mark's journey wasn't easy. He faced challenges, struggles, and moments of doubt. But through it all, he remained true to himself. He never allowed others to define him, and he never let fear control his actions. And in the end, it was his quiet resolve, his ability to stay calm under pressure, that made all the difference. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation where the world is pushing you to be louder, to fight harder, or to give up, remember Mark's story. Remember that sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who hold their power in check, who wait for the right moment, and who know that the greatest victories come not from force, but from the quiet strength of knowing what's right. We all have the power to change the world. It doesn't matter if we are seen or unseen. It doesn't matter if we are the loudest voice in the room or the quietest person standing in the corner. What matters is what we do, when we choose to act, and how we stand up for what is right. And so, Mark's story doesn't end here. It continues, in the hearts of those who were inspired by his actions. It continues in the city that is slowly healing, in the community that is beginning to unite. It continues in the belief that no matter who you are, no matter how small or unassuming you may seem, you have the power to make a difference. And that is the greatest power of all. As Mark walked away from the rooftop, his heart was light, knowing that the work was just beginning. He had made a difference, but he also knew that change was a long road. There would be more battles, more struggles, but now there was hope. And that hope, that quiet determination, would carry him forward. And so, the city began to heal. The darkness of fear and corruption that had clouded it for so long slowly lifted. People began to believe again. They believed in themselves, in their ability to make a change. They believed that, no matter how dark the world seemed, they too could stand up and fight for what was right.